Well, hey, everybody, and thank you for joining us. We are taking some time here at ClarkCountyToday.com to talk to the Clark County Chair candidates. With me now is Eric Holt, who's running as a Democrat and sort of a political newcomer. You have done campaigns before,
Right.
But you have not been in elected office in Clark County, correct?
Nothing above the PCO level.
Right. So let's talk a little bit, Eric. And first of all, thank you so much for coming in. Just your background. I know that you came to Clark County, about 8 years ago?
Yes.
What brought you to Clark County, and what got you involved in politics?
Well, we only have 30 minutes, so I'm going to try to keep this refined. But my wife had lived in Seattle before, and I've traveled to the Northwest before. And it was early summer 2010, and me and my wife and our young baby and my older son went camping through the North California redwoods, and it's just it's just amazing and it's beautiful, and we were looking for a change in our lives that would be better for all of us, and the Pacific Northwest gives opportunities that are not afforded in Utah in the same aspect. So we talked about it, and I went back to work and found out that there was positions open in Seattle or Portland, and so I put in for a transfer for the Portland location, which was based in Ridgefield at that time. And within 8 weeks, we were moved in the Northwest, and we haven't regretted it for a moment. Clark County is beautiful. It gives opportunities to hike or to go to the ocean or to go to Seattle or to go to, go fishing or whatever you want to do within just, a very short period of time. The school systems in Washington are amazing compared to Utah. And as a truck driver, which was what I was doing when I transferred out, and most of the time I was driving at night to through Wyoming or to Wendover, and pushing snow in a semi is a little bit of a white knuckled experience. Yeah. So I enjoyed the much more temperate weather out here.
So when you talk a little bit about the livability that brings people to Clark County, you're sort of living proof of that.
Right.
So you have kind of that in the back of your mind when you're looking at what's bringing people here, what brought you here. We'll get to that a little bit more. Right. I want to talk a little bit about some of your views of growth in the county. The county chair position is reaching pretty high, I think, in terms of an elected office. You reached a little higher last time around, I think.
Right.
But what made you focus on that race?
Well, all representation in our areas is important, and it's important to give the people in our communities voice. And I live in the 18th, which previous to this year was a fairly conservative area, and as a Democrat, I didn't feel like I got much option to vote for. Year after year, there would be one name on the ticket, or just not a lot of options. So. It's important for people to get engaged, and my first run in 2016 for the state senate was a deep dive into education, into different aspects of what it takes to be a legislator, and what issues are facing people in our community, and what things that you want to be engaged in, and so. After that race, I did fairly well. I built a lot of really good relationships, and I stood back and I said, if this is a way I truly want to be engaged in our community, and that I want to make change, and I want to make things better for me and my family and our community, then I have to do something that I'm qualified for, that I can do well, and that I can win. And so doing some research, I figured out that the chair position would be the best fit for my skill set, and so that's what I jumped in for.
What is that skill set?
Well, throughout my history, after being a truck driver, I got into management, and I went to school and got a business degree. And so most of that last several years has been in change management, working with people collaboratively, getting teams together that work and that succeed. And that's, and for the last 2 years that I've been a vice chair for the Washington State Progressive Caucus also, it's all about bringing people together and finding coalitions that can collaborate and be successful.
Now, I got to ask you, I know tattoos are not unusual. In some cases, right. They are unusual for political candidates. Tell me a little bit of the story behind yours.
Well, the biggest part of that story is that I never, ever saw myself running for office. It was not on my radar. From the time I was 5, and my mom got me up and made me sing in front of the entire church, I had done nothing but music. piano lessons, singing, music was my entire life. And as I started to grow and I started my first band at 12, me and my friends from church would get together and we'd play music. And this was all that consumed my life. Through high school, it was just music. I was in every different, orchestra and marching band and rock band. And that was all that I was going to do. And I was going to get signed, and I was going to be a rich and famous rock star. And then I had kids, and I realized that there's more to life than what just revolves around me. It's about providing for your family and giving them an opportunity for better things. And so after many, many years, 25 years of playing music and having roommates as tattoo artists, so they give you all their tattoos for free, and we're gonna tour the world and be famous. Then you realize that you've got to give back. And, we were touring all the time. I would work 10 to 12 hours, sometimes 16 hours a day, go to band practice for 3 or 4 hours, sleep for a few hours, go back to work. The weekends we'd tour and play all weekend long, and I'd never see my family, and I was done with it. I said, I've dedicated a big enough part of my life to this to realize that I've done everything I could possibly do music-wise. I've loved it, but now it's time for me to focus on my family and my community and look introspectively at what I can do to improve our community. And so that's I guess that's the long and short of it.
All right. So back to the race at hand. I'm curious, if you were to win in November, there is a chance, we'll have to see what happens with one district race in particular, but there was a chance that you would technically be the only Democrat
Right.
on the council were you to win. So talk a little bit about, given the chair position being the only at-large position, being the spokesperson for the county, how do you see yourself, should that become the case, working with the rest of the council to be able to, I guess, work to the good of the county?
Well, I see working with the other councilors as a fantastic opportunity to collaborate. Julie Olson is probably the smartest person on the board. She's incredibly intelligent. She really knows her stuff. She is the content expert for most of what goes on that council. So I'm incredibly impressed by her. John Blum, I've met with him a few times. He's an incredibly smart guy. He really cares about our community, so I know that I can work with him. I know that Eileen represents her district well. She cares about the things that are important to her district, and I'm really confident that Temple Lentz is going to win by quite a large margin. If not, Jeannie Stewart is a good person who has really given her life to our community, to Vancouver, and I see no reason why we can't get together and collaborate. Because for really, countywide, there are not really that many issues that are Democratic or Republican. They're providing safety and security to the community, making sure that we're providing all of the community services that we're obligated to by law, by the state of Washington, that requires us to provide these services. And I don't know about you. Maybe there are Domino's potholes nowadays, but there's not Republican or Democratic potholes. So it's all about providing services, making sure we're bringing that level of service to the people who require it, and just being responsible with the taxpayers' money.
Speaking of money, when I had a conversation with Sean Hennessy, the recently hired county manager, I asked him to talk to me a little bit about the challenges he saw. And it comes back to money a lot.
Yeah.
That there aren't a lot of revenue options. Clark County is a bit unusual in that it has so many unincorporated areas that are very developed already, such as Hazeldale and the Salmon Creek area. And that means the necessity to provide services. So there is a budgetary issue. The council, until most recently, had declined to take the 1% property tax increase that the state allows. They did recently. Your opponent was the only person to vote no on that at this time. Would you be in favor of continuing to look at approving that 1% increase?
Definitely. I think it's fiscally irresponsible to put the budget of this county, who provides umbrella services for all of the cities and all of the people in the community, and say we're going to short fund these services and not be able to respond when we need to. When somebody calls the sheriff's department, they expect somebody to show up. When somebody calls the fire department, they want somebody to show up. If we're short funding all of these services that we're required by law, the state of Washington, to provide, we're doing a disservice to the people in our community. Our inflation is going up to 2 to 3% per year. That includes health care benefits and costs for all of the full-time employees. For every time we order a new fire truck, that it's got to be paid for somehow. All of these things that increase at much higher rate than that 1% per year. And so that 1% is just a soft offset for the increase in inflation. And you want our economy to grow at 2 to 3% per year, because that slow, contained, and strong growth of the economy is what keeps our economy so strong. What we don't want is an economic stagnation to where there isn't growth, which we won't have to raise any taxes then, but we also won't be able to provide jobs for those who need them, and we won't be able to provide services who need those. So that growth allows more houses and more homes and buildings to be built, which we get money back into that, increases our sales, and so sales tax comes back in. Now, all that is contained in the growth, but that also has to be offset by the increase.
What other areas would you look at for potentially?
Definitely raising the moratorium on cannabis sales in unincorporated Clark County, because right now Clark County is the highest revenue county in the entirety of Washington. $57 million in sales, or in taxes taken in since cannabis was legalized, and the county has gotten zero of that. Nothing. It goes to the cities who sell. The cities take their portion, they send the rest of the state, but the county's got nothing. And so there is an immense opportunity to open up that market and to provide more jobs and more income for the county.
I want to get back to jobs here in just a sec. The other really big hot button issue, one that you deal with yourself on an almost daily basis, is the commute between Clark County and Portland. The issue of the I-5 bridge has come up again. I think about the time you were moving here was just shortly after the time that the previous Columbia River Crossing project had petered out and died.
Right.
$110 million going along with it. There's been a lot of talk about getting both sides back together again. Kate Brown, the incumbent governor in Oregon, said that if she's reelected, she will make light rail a requirement for that bridge. Is that something that you would support if that's the only means of getting that bridge done?
Well, so I look at the bridge as not only a thoroughfare to get our people back and forth to work efficiently, but also to bring tax dollars into Washington State. And how you do that is make it accessible. And the people of the Metro Portland area, if we want them to come into our recreation, if we want them to go check out the Ridgefield Raptors baseball games, if we want them to come check out our wineries and spend money, if we want them to go to downtown and check out Kiggins or go to the waterfront, then we've got to make it accessible to them. And having those bridges in the bad shape that they are and how they easily clog up is not how we're going to get people over here to spend their money. People in Portland like light rail. So if we had light rail coming across and that stopped at the right at downtown, then people would come over, they'd spend money, and they'd have a lot of fun here. I don't require that a bridge have light rail on it. I'd like to see it light rail ready, at least, just because I look long term. This bridge is 100 years old. If we're going to rebuild the bridge, I expect it to last another 100 years. And in 100 years, I expect some amazing amount of high-speed light rail that goes from probably Vancouver, BC to San Diego. And I don't want to be the stopping point. I don't want to be the embarrassment on the I-5 corridor that says, well, we really have this incredible way of getting from Vancouver to San Diego, except for Vancouver, that couldn't get their stuff together and didn't want to be part of the solution.
Well, let me ask you, during the Columbia River Crossing, I think the voters of Clark County were pretty clear that the majority were not in favor. Right. Do you think that since then opinion has changed in favor of light rail from what you've heard from people? And if, let's say that there was an advisory vote or a poll or something that showed that people still weren't in favor of it, would you still support it even if the majority were not in favor? So
what we have to look at is that this is not Clark County's bridge. This is a federal highway requirement. The federal government's going to come in and put a certain amount of funding into it, and they're going to have requirements that come with it. Oregon is a partner, and they're going to be putting money into it, and they're going to expect a certain amount of requirements for their money. Washington State is going to come in, and they're going to provide, and they're going to. So a very, very small piece of this is going to be Clark County's investment. And yes, we get to use it, but it's not Clark County's bridge. A lot of 72,000 of our citizens cross that bridge every day to go find good-paying jobs, but we're not buying it. So if all of these agencies and all these bureaucracies come together and say, this is what we need to do to make this happen, then the Clark County voters are a share of that, and their voices should be heard, but so should everybody else who's invested in this.
Well, let me ask you about tolling. You speak of federal funding. Do you believe the federal government should pay enough that we don't need local
I love
tolls to
that.
pay for that?
That'd be great if the government came in and really did a bang-up job, and so that we wouldn't have to pay tolls. That would be fantastic. I'd very much support that. I don't think, not just because I have to cross that bridge and I don't want to pay tolls. I get it, but I also realize that elections have consequences. And some of the decisions that were made in the 90s with the people in the legislature in Oregon, in the state and the Senate, and Eileen was a part of that. There were coalitions in there who were against funding the infrastructure for Oregon, of raising any taxes, of bringing any money in so that they could build the infrastructure out. Now we're looking at 20 years later, after many failed attempts at building their infrastructure, Oregon is now at this point where the only way they can finance their infrastructure is to raise, to put taxes on people. So it's unfortunate that we can't have that long-sighted vision of saying, yes, this is going to cost a little bit money per person over the small reign, but over the long term, we're going to have a much better infrastructure because of it. When people come in and shortchange it, then all of a sudden they have to have more drastic measures. So I don't like tolls, but I understand why Oregon has to do it.
A lot of folks that are opposed to the current bridge project, or certainly were opposed to the Columbia River Crossing project, and say we don't need another bridge. We don't need a new bridge there. We need another bridge.
Right.
Would you support the pursuit of a third crossing? And is that something that, given, and I just want to, like in a perfect world,
Right.
something that you could have, would you pursue that project before replacing the interstate bridge? Or do you think that project needs to be done first?
Well, I definitely support a third bridge because I see a future where we can divert heavy truck traffic away from the I-5 corridor at all. If we could find a way to take it from port to port to port and bypass the Portland metro area, would be fantastic. I don't see how we can do it effectively, and I don't see any way that we can create a third bridge that isn't going to cost an immense amount of money through impact investment and environmental impact statements and everything else. The hundreds of millions of dollars that we already dumped into the first bridge is going to have to be all done all over again for a third bridge. So I say let's get the I-5 bridge done before it sinks into the water or an earthquake hits and it floats away from us or whatever. And let's get it done. Let's get it done right, because that's the major thoroughfare. It's the only drawbridge on a major interstate highway on the I-5 corridor, or probably anywhere for that matter. And it's long overdue to be. I mean, it was built for horses and carriages. It was not built for 3 lanes of semis.
Well, let me ask you a final question on that, just real quick. Added traffic capacity or just added mass transit and truck capacity?
Well, I think it should be a combination. I would like to see more capacity, but our biggest problem, though, is we're moving into an age of more technological advancement. And in the next few years, we're going to have fully electronic, fully autonomous vehicles that communicate with the infrastructure on how to bypass roads that are being backed up. And we need to be on the forefront of being technologically advanced enough to be ready for that. And so that's going to be ready for smart rapid transit. The new lanes they're putting along Mill Plain and Fourth Plain for the bus rapid transit are great. They work fantastic. And, so I definitely support, a rapid transit component.
Okay, I think we could probably talk about transportation for the rest of the time.
Sure.
We've got to move on. Let's talk a little bit about affordable housing and job creation, because to you, from what I've heard you say at the League of Women Voters Forum last week, you see those two things as connected.
Right.
There's one school of thought that says building more houses will make housing more affordable. You seem to indicate that you would like a two-tiered approach.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that.
Well, and this is one of the really neat classes that I got to take when I was doing my degree is on economics and the different scales of economics. And supply and demand is not always doesn't transfer over into more affordable housing. In the case of this, where it's an incredibly hot market, and because houses are relatively affordable in Clark County compared to the surrounding areas, if we increase the supply of housing in Clark County, what happens is people from Seattle, people from Portland, people from other areas, San Francisco, move here for the incredibly cheap housing, relatively cheap housing, and then just buy up the houses before the people who live in the communities can afford them. The problem that we have is the median income for people who live in Clark County is lower than the median income for medium level housing prices. So that right there is an offset. You can't qualify for most of the houses in Clark County because you don't make enough money. So what we need to do to make housing affordable in Clark County is bring up the pay for workers. Bring in more jobs that are higher wage, high tech, and that's how we make housing affordable. We focus on dense, walkable communities within the urban growth boundaries so that people can live, work, and play all in the same community. Well, it takes out the transportation component, it adds more affordable housing, and it keeps good paying jobs where people can afford to live.
That's called the smart growth plan. Because that was going to be one of my other questions, whether you prefer the smart growth or whether you prefer added ability of people who live in the outlying areas maybe to sell off a parcel of their land in order to develop on that. Because obviously you've got to find that balance, right? I mean, when you're talking about there's plenty of developable land potentially within the county.
Oh, yeah.
But there's that debate over the urban growth boundary and our growth management act. I mean, how do you see sort of balancing taking advantage of the resources we have without using them up, I guess?
As chair, I look at Washington state law not as debatable as the law that has to be followed. And so the Growth Management Act is something that has to be followed, or we don't get, right now we're out of compliance. So we're not going to get certain grants or subsidies from the state of Washington for that. When we're already coming up against an $8 million budget shortfall, and now we don't get grants and support from the state, that shows a lack of leadership or collaboration with the state, one of our partners. So the Growth Management Act just definitely has to be followed. It has to be respected, and we have to have growth in a smart, sustainable way that adheres to that. So I do support people who, a grandfather who has 80 acres and he wants to break off a piece for a family member who wants to stay and help him farm. I totally support that, and I think there's ways we can work that out. But breaking off 20 acres for a subdivision does not fall within the parameters of the Growth Management Act, and therefore we need to come up with different solutions.
So let me ask you, you talked about high-tech, high-wage jobs. What's your vision for how we accomplish that? We talked a little bit about the freight rail dependent uses plan along the Chilhowee Prairie line. You and I have talked about that before. You're not in favor of the way the council is going with that.
Right.
I guess let's merge these two questions into one. What would you prefer to see done there? Since there is developable land, there is a resource in the rail line that the county owns. So how do you use that resource effectively? And also, how do you bring in high-tech, high-wage jobs that you'd like to see in the county?
Well, let's start with the second one first. Luckily, I don't have to be the smartest guy in the room. It's not my vision. It's a vision that's already in place along the Discovery Corridor. They've got some of the colleges that are bringing research centers and the hospitals that are looking at, that are going into that the Discovery Corridor, and they're also bringing in dark fiber and fiber optic networks so that we can provide the services to the high-tech industry to come in here and provide those good-paying jobs that currently we're driving over the bridge for, which ties into the freight rail dependent use. When we're talking about bringing in manufacturing and industry into that area, most of those jobs are low or low wage, minimum wage, high labor jobs. You're not going to get a majority of these 72,000 people who are driving over to Portland every year for six-figure jobs are not going to stop there and come to work for $20 an hour, breaking their backs in Clark County. It's just not a feasible option. Bringing industry into Clark County in people's backyards who do not want it is not smart politics. You've got to do what the people in that community want. And because a couple of people tend to benefit from it, it doesn't mean it's what's best for the community as a whole. Clark County has owned that railroad since 1986. Since 1889, when it was first built, it has never been a successful investment for anybody. It has failed multiple times. On its last bankruptcy in 1984, Clark County bought it in 1986, and we have not made a dime on it since that time. We've leased it to Portland Vancouver Junction Railroad since 2004. So we are 14 years into a 30-year lease with two more 30-year options, so up to 90-year lease. And they don't pay Clark County anything for that railroad until they exceed 1,000 rail cars per year, at that which point they pay us $10 per car above that. So for 14 years, we still haven't made any money on it as a piece of industry. And if we increase industry to the point to where we actually are starting to make money on that railway, we're going to have to bring in 10 to 12,000 cars per year. If we bring in 10 to 12,000 rail cars per year, that's bringing 50 to 60,000 trucks into that small community per year to bring that finished goods off, because you bring raw goods in by rail, you finish the goods, and you truck it out by semis. That community does not have the infrastructure to handle 50 to 60,000 trucks, along with 10 to 12,000 rail cars. And the people in that community didn't move there to be in an industrial zone. So I feel for them and I support them, and I think that we can do much better along that as Clark County if we just supported agritourism. I mean, how does Clark County make money? We've got property taxes, we get grants from the state, and we have sales tax. Well, sales tax is a great way to make money, especially if it's tourism sales tax, because where else in the Portland metro area can somebody come in and do an agro tour train ride from Vancouver to Yakult, stop off at wineries, at farm-to-table restaurants and farms, and just have an incredible experience along a beautiful trail and have this beautiful green jewel in the center of Clark County for all of us to enjoy. So,
we're running out of time. I got to move on because I want to talk about that a little bit more. But
Sure.
The county's building permit process.
Mm-hmm.
There've been a lot of complaints.
Yep.
It needs to be streamlined. It's inefficient. It takes too long. How would you go about fixing that?
Well, I'd make sure that our IT department is funded properly, because that's where those efficiencies can come in. You can go in and you can make it a lot more accessible for people to start doing their initial application process through the online, and they can get everything in line, know what they're going to need to bring with them before they even show up. And when they have it and it's ready and it's already approved, you can stamp and go, and it'll be a lot quicker. It needs to be fair for everybody, so that if somebody wants to put a bathroom in their garage, or if somebody's building a development, everybody needs to have the same accessibility. It needs to be quick, it needs to be efficient, and that comes through technology.
All right. I want to ask you this. So obviously if you win, that's how elections work, especially in Washington, where there's only two candidates. It means the majority of people voted for you.
Right.
So I wanted to ask you, when it comes to your view on government, is it majority rules, or because they voted for you, or are there certain things that even if the majority of the population were not in favor of them, you would continue to do?
Well,
And I know it's a tough
it
question,
is
but-
tough, because we're a representative republic, and so the majority of the people of Washington, of the Clark County, would be voting for me to represent their best interests. But I think it's also important to reinvigorate, go back out. What I'd like to see the chair position do more of is do regular town hall meetings. Show up to 5 or 6 different neighborhood association meetings every month and listen to the people and say, what are your concerns? What are we not doing right? What are we doing right? What can we do better? And that's really what the chair position needs to be doing, is really getting engaged with the public and listening to them on the grand scale, because that's how you hear from the majority of people who really, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. The people in these neighborhood associations, they want to make sure that their voices are heard because they care about their communities. And all of those 25 or 26 neighborhood associations in Clark County need to be listened to on a regular basis. And so that's how I would lead as chair, by getting engaged with the people and finding out as directly as possible, putting out surveys, making myself accessible, and getting to as many meetings as possible to make sure that I'm staying with the will of the people.
We've talked about a lot of the challenges facing the county. Anything that we haven't talked about that you want to mention?
Oh, wow, put me on the spot here.
I could probably name a couple, but
I mean, I think we've hit a lot of stuff, but if there's something else you wanted to cover, please.
just take a minute and talk about the jail, because obviously that's going to be that's a huge bill coming due at some point.
Yeah.
Whatever the advisory committee comes back with, and that will be something that, if you were to win this election, would fall to you, because it's probably going to be early next year by the time the council
April
gets its hands on that.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about your understanding of that issue. I've heard you talk a little bit about the fact that you would like to look at some other alternatives to reduce the jail population.
Right, yeah. And I think that's the end game for all of society. We're not a warehousing, the jail systems should not be a way to warehouse people that you can't deal with in society. It should be a last option. So we need to look at diversion techniques of how to get people who might be suffering from a mental health crisis. The worst place you can put them in is a jail, because then they're not getting the treatment that they need, they're not getting the medications that they need. All of the things that can compound it and make it worse is what a jail is. So we need to be able to have crisis response officers who are trained to deal with people having a mental health crisis and get them taken care of and do the right place before we get them. Because as taxpayers, the minute they show up in the jail, that starts costing us an immense amount of money that it didn't have to cost us. So we don't want to do, and substance abuse. We want them to get them into treatment, get them on a path that's going to make them successful members of society, and not warehousing where we're paying their room and board. That's not, and then you're adding more trauma onto their whatever's causing their substance abuse issues anyway. So what we need to do is focus on the people who have no choice but need to be incarcerated because they have a debt to society. They need to pay that. So our first objective is the day one that they get in there, how do we get them back on a path, back out to society to be productive? And that should be our goal, not warehousing them just so they can serve their time, but making sure that time is productive and educational and getting them as members of, because they're human beings. And whether we disagree with whatever choices they've made in life or what path led them there, we need to be forgiving and we need to get them back as members of society as soon as we can.
So finally, let's talk a little bit about your vision for Clark County, say 10, 20 years down the road. What do you see Clark County becoming?
Well, I really see Clark County as becoming a destination spot for the people in the area, the jewel, where they can come here and experience incredible, activities as fishing and river rafting and all kinds of things. And I'd love to see that, the idea of an agritourism train where people can ride on this beautiful old steam train from Vancouver to Yakult and stop into wineries and stop into the breweries and the distilleries and check out the farm-to-table farms. And I'd love to see walkable communities that are accessible, because right now Clark County has one of the fastest aging populations in the area. And we need to make sure that the communities are accessible for people so that they can age in place and not lose their homes and not lose their quality of life. So we need to look at the accessibility of these communities that are being developed and make sure that people with disabilities can also enjoy it. People of low income can also be a part of the community, and make sure that we're also looking at sustainability in what we're developing. Are we adding green technology into it so that when we're in 20 or 30 years, we're not as fossil fuel dependent, so we can be ahead of the curve and be, I'd like to see Clark County being one of the places that are setting the standard for Washington and not following the trends.
All right, this is the part of the interview where you can look into that camera if you want.
Yeah.
It's sort of your closing statement and say your final words to the voters.
Well, I'm Eric Holt. I'm running for the Clark County Chair. I'd love to be your voice on the council, and I hope you vote for me before November 6th.
All right. Eric Holt, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Don't forget, November 6th is the election. Make sure you get out and vote, whichever way you vote. Very much appreciate you taking the time to watch this Q&A with Eric Holt, who's running for County Chair. I'm Chris Brown. This is ClarkCountyToday.com.